She was mid-photo shoot when a single song stopped her cold, and in an instant, Riley Keough wasn't in the studio anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. The studio was buzzing. Bright white flashes lit up the room every few seconds. Assistants rushed back and forth with makeup brushes, combs, and steamers. The air smelled faintly of hairspray and fresh coffee. Riley Keough stood in the center, calm but focused, shifting her pose slightly with each click of the camera. She'd done this 100 times before. Photo shoots were part of her life now, another Tuesday, another campaign, another set of lights in her eyes. She moved with an easy grace, her smile warm, her eyes bright. The photographer leaned over to adjust a lens, mumbling to himself. Someone off to the side swapped a prop. The music playing in the background was just like it always was during shoots, light, upbeat, modern. And then something changed. A faint crackle came from a speaker in the corner. The shuffle playlist faded, and the first soft guitar notes floated through the air. It was that song, Wise Men Say. Her body went still. It wasn't obvious to the whole room, but to Riley it felt like every muscle froze for a split second. Her smile wavered just for the briefest moment before she caught herself and eased it back into place. But inside, her chest tightened. She knew this voice. She had known it all her life. Elvis Presley. To the world, he was the king. To her, he was grandpa. The crew kept working, unaware of what just happened. No one noticed that her eyes had stopped following the camera and were now fixed somewhere far beyond the flashing lights. It was like time had slowed. The sound of the song wrapped around her, soft and heavy, tugging at something deep in her memory. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just another track on the playlist. This was a thread, one that could pull her right out of the present and straight into the past. What would it bring back? A smile, a tear, or something she hadn't let herself feel in years. The photographer called her name. She blinked, shook herself slightly, and turned back toward the lens. But the music kept playing, and with each note, the pull grew stronger. She didn't know it yet, but this song was about to unlock a door she hadn't stepped through in a very long time. That morning had started like so many others. The sun was just rising when Riley's car pulled up outside the studio, a large converted warehouse with tall windows and an industrial hum. She was there to shoot for a fashion spread, something elegant but modern. Inside, the crew was already setting up. Cables ran across the floor, lights stood like giant metal flowers, and racks of clothing waited in the corner. Riley greeted everyone with a smile. She had a quiet way of making people feel at ease, a soft laugh here, a quick thank, you there. The makeup artist led her to a high stool, and soon the gentle tap of brushes and the faint smell of powder filled the air. Her hair was curled into loose waves, each strand smoothed into place. Someone adjusted the collar of her dress. Another stylist held up jewelry to see which pieces caught the light best. This was her world, organized chaos. Every shoot was its own little whirlwind, voices talking over one another, zippers closing, fabric rustling, camera shutters clicking in rapid bursts. And always there was music. Usually it was a carefully curated playlist. Pop hits, indie tracks, something to keep the energy up and the mood light. It was background noise, nothing more. Today started no differently. She barely noticed the songs at first, a beat here, a chorus there, while she focused on her poses and the rhythm of the photographer's voice telling her when to turn or lift her chin. But then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. The playlist cut out mid-beat. There was a tiny pause, long enough to make her glance toward the speaker. And then came that familiar static, the sound of an old recording waking to life. The room didn't change, but it felt different. Maybe no one else noticed. The stylists kept adjusting hems, the photographer kept adjusting settings, but Riley felt the air get heavier, more still. It wasn't just a song playing, it was his song. It was like the studio's bright white walls had faded away, replaced by warm tones and soft shadows. She wasn't standing under flashing strobes anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. In her mind, she could see old photographs. She could hear her mother's voice telling stories. She could almost smell that faint mix of leather, wood, and old fabric from another time. She didn't move at first. She just let the notes sink in. The photographer, oblivious, gave a cheerful, "That's great, Riley, hold it right there." And she did, but she wasn't holding it for the camera. She was holding it because her mind was starting to drift. Drift toward a time long before the photo shoots, before the red carpets, before she was Riley Keough, actress and model. Back to when she was just a little girl, and Elvis Presley was more than a legend. He was a part of her family. And the song, it was about to take her there. The melody wrapped around her like a slow tide. Riley's shoulders shifted just slightly, as if a weight had settled there. Her smile, still faintly holding for the camera, was no longer the smile she'd walked in with. This one was softer, distracted. She wasn't in the studio anymore. She was back in her mother's living room. It had been a warm Tennessee afternoon. She must have been 6 or 7. The sunlight had a golden haze to it, slipping through the tall windows and landing in long stripes across the floor. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish, the kind her grandmother liked to use. Somewhere in the corner, a record player spun, and from it that voice poured out, smooth, deep, full of something she didn't understand yet but could feel. As a child, she didn't think of Elvis Presley as a superstar. She didn't know about sold-out stadiums or gold records stacked like trophies. He was the king in her world. He was a man in framed photographs, always smiling, always somehow larger than the paper he was printed on. He was a name her mother spoke with a softness in her voice. "Your grandpa," she would say, showing Riley a picture, and Riley would look closely, tilting her head, trying to find the connection. Did she have his eyes, his smile? The songs were always around. Not every day, not always front and center, but enough that they seeped into her memory like light through a curtain. Some were joyful, quick, and bright. Others carried something deeper. That afternoon, she'd sat cross-legged on the carpet, turning the square cardboard covers of old records in her lap. The edges were worn, the colors slightly faded, the way things get when they've been handled for years. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming along to the music as she made tea. Riley traced her fingers over the lettering on one album, Blue Hawaii. She didn't know what Hawaii was, but she imagined it must be somewhere far away and warm. The music filled the house in a way no other sound did. It was more than just notes. It was part of the walls, part of the air. Even then, she felt the quiet reverence it carried. No one spoke over certain songs. No one interrupted. When his voice came through the speakers, people listened. In her memory, there were moments when Lisa Marie would pause, eyes far away, as if she were remembering something only she could see. Riley never asked what those moments were about. She just sat nearby, letting the music wash over both of them. Now in the studio years later, the same feeling crept in. That sense of something intimate, sacred almost. She blinked slowly, her lashes lowering for a fraction longer than necessary. She could almost feel the Tennessee sun on her face, almost hear the distant sound of cicadas outside. The photographer called out another pose, and she obeyed, but her mind didn't move with her body. It stayed in that living room with the record spinning and her mother humming. It struck her then, the song wasn't just taking her back to her grandfather. It was taking her back to her childhood, to a time when she didn't have to think about interviews, scripts, premieres, or expectations. Just a girl, a record player, and a voice that belonged to family. The notes swelled in the studio speaker, and Riley took in a slow breath. She knew the heavy memories hadn't even arrived yet. Those would come later. But this first wave, it was all warmth, all sunlight, all the soft edges of growing up with a legacy she didn't yet fully understand. Back in the studio, the camera clicked again. The lights flashed, but Riley barely noticed. The song had moved past its opening lines now, deeper into its melody. Each note seemed to pull a thread inside her, unraveling something she usually kept tightly wound. She thought about what it meant, really meant, to be Elvis Presley's granddaughter. Most people assumed it was all glamour. They saw the red carpet appearances, the glossy magazine spreads, the interviews where journalists always found a way to bring him up. What's it like having such a famous grandfather? Do you feel his influence in your career? Does his music inspire you? She would smile politely, answer gracefully, sometimes even with humor. She learned how to navigate those questions, but none of those public moments ever felt like this. This was different. Here there were no cameras rolling for an audience, no microphone in her face, just a room full of people doing their jobs and a song slipping into the cracks of her heart. She thought about how strange it was to be tied so closely to someone she'd never met. Her grandfather had died long before she was born. She knew him only through photographs, stories, and the echo of his voice in old recordings. And yet the connection was real, unshakable. It was in the way her mother spoke about him, equal parts pride and pain. It was in the way strangers lit up when they learned who her grandfather was, as if just hearing his name brought back their own memories. Sometimes that legacy felt like a gift, other times it felt like a shadow. Because living in the shadow of someone as monumental as Elvis Presley meant constantly being compared, whether she wanted to be or not. Her own achievements, the roles she'd taken, the projects she'd poured herself into were often filtered through the lens of his fame. And yet she'd never wanted to distance herself from it. How could she? It was part of her. But in moments like this, unexpected, private, the weight of it felt different. It wasn't about interviews or public image. It was about blood and memory, about a voice that somehow bridged generations. She closed her eyes for half a second, letting the sound fill her completely. She wasn't just hearing her grandfather's voice, she was feeling it. There was a quiet grief in knowing she'd never get to sit across from him, never get to hear him tell stories firsthand. She'd never get to see if he laughed like she did, or if he'd have been proud of the path she'd chosen. Those thoughts sat heavy, but they didn't crush her. They just lived inside her the way some truths do. When she opened her eyes again, the studio looked the same racks of clothing, the same bright lights. But to her, the room felt smaller, more intimate, as if the music had pulled everything closer. Her mind flicked to moments in her career where Elvis's name had been part of the headline. A film premiere where a reporter had asked if she thought she'd inherited his star quality. A photo shoot where they'd styled her hair in a way that made people draw comparisons to Priscilla. Those moments had been curated, controlled, this one was. Here she wasn't being asked to talk about Elvis. She wasn't even being asked to think about him. The music had done it on its own, opened the door without knocking. And now she was standing in the doorway, knowing she could either step through or shut it again. She didn't shut it. Because some legacies aren't meant to be hidden away. They're meant to be felt, even when it catches you off guard, even when it stings a little. The camera clicked again, and Riley adjusted her pose. But in her mind, the shoot had faded into the background. She was somewhere else entirely, and the song, it was still playing. The chorus floated through the studio air, slow and steady. Riley didn't notice when her hands eased down to her sides, fingers curling lightly. Her thoughts had shifted again. This time, they didn't take her to childhood. They took her somewhere harder. Somewhere she didn't like to linger. It was quiet in the memory. Too quiet. She was sitting on the floor of her living room, the lights turned off except for the faint orange glow from the street outside. A blanket was wrapped around her shoulders. Though it didn't really matter, grief has its own kind of cold, one that seeps in no matter what you wear. It had been only weeks since Lisa Marie passed. The days before and after blurred together, a mix of calls, arrangements, and moments where she'd simply stared at nothing, trying to understand how the world kept turning. That night, she'd reached for her headphones without thinking too much about it. They were heavy in her hands, the kind that covered her ears completely. She wanted silence, but the kind of silence that still had sound in it, the quiet of music. Her thumb hovered over her phone's screen, unsure of what to choose. She could have picked something safe, something with no emotional weight, but her mind, almost against her will, scrolled to his name. Elvis Presley. She tapped it. And then that song. She hadn't listened to it in years. Not like this, not alone, not without the noise of everyday life around her. The first notes were like stepping into cold water, a shock to the chest. She froze, letting the sound settle over her, into her, through her. At first, the lyrics felt almost too much. Wise men say, only fools rush in. Her throat tightened. She pressed her palm against her chest as if it might hold her together. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her mother. Her mother who'd grown up with those songs in her veins. Her mother whose stories had built Riley's own connection to a man she'd never met. Now both of them were gone. And all she had left in that moment was the voice of one and the memory of the other, braided together in the space between notes. She closed her eyes and let herself sink into it. The grief was sharp, but there was comfort there too, a strange warmth in knowing that they were connected through this one thing, this music. It was as if the song itself became a mirror, showing her the pieces of herself that came from both of them. The softness in her smile, the stubbornness in her will, the way she carried her past quietly even when it was heavy. She listened to the song twice that night. Once to cry, once to breathe. Now, standing in the studio, the memory felt close enough to touch. Her eyes began to glisten, though she didn't blink the tears away immediately. She let them hang there, invisible to most, a secret between her and the song. The photographer adjusted his stance, peering through the lens. Maybe he noticed, maybe he didn't, but he said nothing. The music kept playing, and Riley, still posing, was miles away from the flashing lights and bustling crew. Midway through the song, the rhythm of the studio returned. The photographer lowered his camera and gave a bright, almost oblivious grin. "You look amazing, Riley. Let's do one more with that smile." She gave a small laugh, quick, polite, the kind that keeps the mood light, but inside her chest was still tight. She shifted her pose, tilting her chin, curling her lips into the shape of a smile. But it wasn't the same kind of smile she'd given earlier. This one was thinner, quieter, meant more for the camera than for herself. No one said anything, but she could feel it, a subtle awareness in the room. The stylists moved a little slower, their chatter softening. The makeup artist glanced at her just for a second before looking away. They might not have known exactly what was happening, but they sensed the shift. She inhaled deeply, then let the breath out slowly as if she were grounding herself. The music was still there, winding through the last verse, but she tried to focus on the here and now. The studio, the lights, the work. Still, she couldn't help it, her eyes closed briefly. Just long enough to let the sound wash over her one more time before it ended. There was no dramatic breakdown, no visible moment that would stop the shoot. Just a quiet pause, a space in the day where something personal unfolded entirely within her. When the song faded into the next track, it felt almost abrupt, like someone had closed a book mid-sentence. She opened her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "All right," she said softly, almost to herself, and stepped into the next pose. The camera clicked again, the crew moved forward, the day carried on. But she knew something in her had shifted, even if no one else could see it. It wasn't sadness exactly, though the ache was there. It was more like a reminder that music isn't just sound. It's memory, it's connection, and sometimes it finds you when you least expect it. By the time they wrapped the final shots, her expression was steady again. But in her chest, the echo of that song still lingered. The studio was emptying out. Most of the crew had already packed their bags, their laughter and light conversation drifting toward the hallway. The racks of clothing stood half-covered now, the bright dresses and tailored jackets hidden under plastic sheeting. Someone unplugged a light, and the sudden absence of its hum made the space feel quieter. Riley stayed seated on the stool in the middle of the room, still in the same outfit, still with her hair styled just so. The makeup artist had left a compact on the counter nearby, but she didn't reach for it. Her gaze was fixed somewhere on the floor, not at a speck of dust, not at her shoes, but at nothing in particular. It was strange, she thought, how a single song could open a door in your mind and invite every decade of your life to walk through it. She walked through her childhood again today, the afternoons at her mother's house. The scent of Graceland's polished wood and old photographs. The sound of Elvis Presley's voice slipping through a record player's gentle crackle. She walked through loss again, too. That quiet night after Lisa Marie passed, when the same voice filled her headphones and wrapped her in both grief and comfort. And today, she'd felt all of it at once. The world saw her grandfather as an icon, a legend, a name that would never fade from music history. But she'd never known that version of him. To her, he was family she'd never met, a part of her life that was always present but never in the room. Maybe that's why his music hit her the way it did. It wasn't just nostalgia, it wasn't just heritage, it was a voice that somehow made absence feel less empty. She exhaled slowly, the sound of her breath echoing faintly in the big, quiet space. Outside the window, the city was glowing. Streetlights blinked on, their reflections stretching across the slick pavement below. Somewhere in some bar or diner, she imagined that same song playing on a jukebox, and someone else feeling their own flood of memories. She smiled faintly at the thought. Legacies aren't just passed down through bloodlines. They're carried in the way a voice can make you stop in your tracks, in the way certain melodies seem to fit into your own life, even when they were written decades before you were born. For Riley, her grandfather's legacy wasn't only about the history books or the photographs or the endless public comparisons. It was about the moments in between, the private, unplanned ones. Like today, the song had come and gone, but it left something behind. A reminder, a connection, a thread tying her to both the man the world adored and the mother she still missed every day. She finally stood, gathering her things slowly, like she didn't want to break the fragile stillness of the moment. The crew was almost gone now, just a couple of voices calling goodnight from the far end of the hallway. She slung her bag over her shoulder and took one last glance at the empty studio. And for a second, she thought she heard the faintest echo of those first guitar notes, not from the speakers, but from somewhere much quieter, somewhere inside her. She left with a soft smile, the kind that doesn't need anyone else to see it to be real. You know, moments like this remind me that the stories behind a song are often bigger than the music itself. If you've ever had a song that stopped you in your tracks, one that carried you back to a memory you didn't even know you were holding, you understand exactly what Riley felt that day. And Riley's story with her grandfather is far from over. There's another moment, just as private, just as surprising, where a single gesture from a stranger brought her closer to Elvis's world than she ever expected. If you want to hear that one, stay with me. Because the next story, it might be the most personal one yet.